If you take one step outside of rich person world, where everything is just fine, the first thing you notice is that people are really worried about the economy, not just the macro economy, the effect of monetary policy on the world, but their own personal economies. People in the United States are running out of money, not the homeless, the middle class, even the upper middle class. They're running out of money. And now Christmas is here. So that's a huge problem because everything is more expensive. You've probably already seen how a typical $20 grocery list in 1990 would now cost you $72. That would have been $44 just last year. So 44 to 72 in 1 year, but it's actually worse than that. Since Joe Biden took office, the price of virtually everything you buy has skyrocketed. Bacon up 24%, eggs 41%, alcohol 11%, airfare 42%. Heating oil, 20%. It goes on and on and on. And as the prices have gone up, so have credit card rates, up to 23% from 16%. So there's no denying that the country is poorer and far deeper in debt. How bad is it and what happens next? Now, most economists you see on television are busy telling you about the stock market. This is up, this is down. Most don't pay any attention to this, and the ones who do lie about it. By and large, Stephanie Pomboy does not. We trust her on these questions. She's the founder and president of Macro Mavens and joins us now for an overview. Stephanie, thank you so much for coming on. So that was just a quick snapshot of where the average household is trying to buy staples to live. But if you wouldn't mind broadening it out a little bit, it feels like everything is much more expensive. That's true, correct?
Yes, it is. It is absolutely true. Contrary to what other people on Wall Street and out of the administration might have you believe. I think, it's interesting for us to have this conversation now because I've spent the last 2 days doing business news media talking about the latest slew of inflation numbers. And in the background, you see the stock market on an absolute tear. Wall Street, the administration, the Federal Reserve are all taking a massive victory lap because these reported inflation numbers have slowed from 9% to just 3%. But as you outlined, Tucker, for the average American, the price of everything went up massively. And now it's just going up at a slightly less eye-watering pace. I mean, everything is usuriously expensive and it's getting more expensive slightly slower. And so for them, this isn't cause for celebration. I would footnote, since you kind of led me there, that these numbers themselves are highly flawed. I mean, this will not shock you, Tucker, but because they're manufactured by the government, they tend to understate inflation. The reason being that all of the cost of living adjustments that things like Social Security are tied to and our tax payments are tied to are tied to this particular measure. So it behooves them to keep that number as low as possible. So in the real world, first off, inflation never peaked at 9. In the real world, it was probably 20%, and who knows what it really is now. Just by way of example, this latest inflation number that came out reported a 33% decline in healthcare insurance year over year. I don't know about you, but I think my healthcare insurance is probably up about that amount this year. So these numbers are complete nonsense. And then I would go on, if I may, to just highlight that the real problem is not only has the price of goods gone up, but income growth hasn't kept pace. And this has been a major issue. For comparison, under Biden, real disposable income, which is your income after taxes, adjusting for that government measure of inflation, so not even real world inflation, has declined $800 billion. Just for comparison, under Trump, it rose 4.3 trillion. So, I mean, this is a massive hole for households. And what are they doing? They're borrowing, as you mentioned, at 23% credit card rates just to keep up. Net interest payments for households have doubled since Biden took office and are now the highest level of income since the global financial crisis, the Great Recession in 2008. So long story short, Tucker, yes, households are seriously struggling in a way that we haven't, frankly, seen in decades.
So at some point, people won't be able to pay. I mean, it's harder than ever to get a home equity loan, I notice. So people are going to run out of ways to raise money. They can't force their own wages up. So they're going to be putting much more of their expenditures on credit cards. It feels like they already are. What's the default rate? Are we seeing a rise in that on credit card debt?
Well, this is sort of classic Wall Street analysis. The default rate hit very low levels during this COVID stimulus spectacular when the government was sending checks to people's mailboxes, and people actually cleverly paid down debt with a lot of that money. So the default rates hit these incredibly low depressed levels. And now we're starting to move higher. And so the numbers have moved up sharply and are now kind of back to where they were following that global financial crisis. But everyone sort of takes comfort that they're just normalizing from the prior levels. So this is all nonsense. I mean, they're already moving up very rapidly back to those prior recession levels. And I think on their way much higher because, as we just talked about, incomes aren't keeping up. The inflation numbers are, really fraudulent. So households are struggling and they are running up credit card debt, which is just mind-boggling given that they have to pay 24% interest. Another thing that they're doing, which is new and, really novel to me, not something I would ever consider, but these buy now, pay later programs that, if you go to Home Depot and you buy a saw, you can buy now, pay later, and it's essentially a layaway plan. These businesses are absolutely booming, but the non-payment rate on these things is massive. The last time I saw a statistic, it was like 20 or 30% of people who put things on layaway don't even make the first payment on it. So there's going to be hell to pay eventually when all this comes home to roost.
So the main source of ready cash for people is credit cards. And if they're charging 24%, and that debt cannot be discharged through bankruptcy, thanks to Joe Biden's work on behalf of the credit card companies in the Senate. And they, of course, bought his house for him and gave his son a job in exchange for that. But I'm wondering, why is there no conversation about the credit card companies? If I'm in the mafia and I charge 24% interest, I'm a loan shark and I go to jail. But the credit card companies are not treated as criminals, which obviously they are. They're treated as heroes. When do we get the national conversation about anyone who lends money at 24%?
It's interesting, Tucker, because they have really clamped down on the payday loan guys,
Right.
Which really, their rates were around 24%. So it's now you wonder, what's the difference, So, and you don't want, I was going to say, you don't want to get too cynical, but you really have to about which big credit card companies are in, have effective lobbying in with Washington. I mean, clearly, this is just like the big bank cartel, the big credit card companies. In fact, the banks and the credit card companies are largely one and the same anymore. So I think maybe that answers your question, right?
I wonder if, if a huge percentage of the population stopped paying their credit card bills, what could they do about it?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think we're going to get an answer to that question soon. We are seeing delinquency rates go up. So people are running up debt on these credit cards and they're not paying it. And I think the way push will come to shove is that it's going to reverberate through the financial markets as these losses mount. And as you and I have talked about previously, back when Silicon Valley Bank failed, it's not like the banks are in ship shape right now either, because they're sitting on massive losses on their security holdings. So once these loan losses start to pick up on credit cards and everything else, commercial real estate, et cetera, they're going to have a real problem. And when we get a problem in the financial system, policymakers will wake up and they will, as always, close the barn door after the horse is already out.
Right. Exactly.
So I think we're going to have to go through the crisis first, sadly. And as always, Tucker, it's the middle America that gets hit the hardest with all of this. And they pay the price for egregious monetary and fiscal policy that really fueled this inflation and then necessitated these massive interest rate increases to quash it. That is now making, homes unaffordable and credit card debt usurious. And really, it's a really tough spot. Meanwhile, they're uncorking the champagne at the White House and on Wall Street.
This is a kind of behavior that, that sparks revolutions. I hope we don't have one, but a violent one. But it does seem very reckless. So, how do you foresee this unfolding over the next 12 months? It's an election year. Obviously, the administration is doing everything it can to prop up a fake economy until
Yeah.
election day. But what, if you had to guess, what do you think is going to happen over the next year?
Gosh, well, I've been surprised that it hasn't happened yet, to be honest, because of these rate increases and the issues we just talked about. The consumer is the engine of the US economy.
Yes.
And it's clear from every measure of consumer confidence that you see that they are deep in recession. So, whatever statistics the government might produce, the consumer really is not feeling like this is a good economy. My sense is that these interest rate increases that now everyone is giddily anticipating are going to reverse will eventually reverse, but not fast enough to bail out all of the issues that we've built up here in terms of the delinquency rates rising for consumers. And we're seeing it in the corporate side, and that's a big issue. It's one thing for Joe Sixpack to stop paying his credit card bill. It's another thing for WeWork to go out of business and stop paying its debtors. And, those kind of things have happened. We've seen corporate bankruptcy filings at the fastest pace since the global financial crisis. That stuff adds up. And it also blows back to Main Street because those jobs don't exist anymore when the company goes out of business. So I think, unfortunately, I see a fairly nasty setup for 2024 with a lot of companies closing down because they can't manage their debt service and laying off a lot of people and making the situation for the average guy even more challenging. So I wish I had a happier message, but
Yes.
Eventually you got to pay the piper for these policies. And we have been running just the most reckless monetary and fiscal policies really almost around the globe of anyone. And it's about time that we finally pay the price for that.
So, I mean, I'm not that old, but even I remember a world in which people were suspicious of debt, and it was not considered a virtue to be in hock to somebody else, and it was considered crazy and reckless to base, your business, much less your economy, on debt. And then all of a sudden, things changed pretty crisply, and debt became like a respectable business. I sell debt, distressed debt, and then we based the whole economy on debt, and obviously that was insane. But how do you think that change took place in attitudes?
Well, it's interesting. So that really started back in the early 80s. And frankly, I guess not surprisingly, we had that peak in interest rates. And as interest rates started to come down, the allure of debt became more and more appealing because you could borrow at lower and lower interest rates.
Right.
And then, as you said, Tucker, that kind of became the engine of growth for the economy. And we stopped being people who built real things. And we outsourced all that, hard labor to countries like China and Indonesia and India and whatnot. And we got into the manufacture of paper, which I guess is a much more elegant thing to do. You don't get your fingernails dirty doing that kind of stuff. So we let the rest of the world produce all of our widgets and stuff and pharmaceuticals, as it turns out, while we manufactured paper claims. And then we imagined that we could grow forever on all this debt that we were printing because the rest of the world was so enamored with our dollars that they would continue to fling money at us for any, as egregious as our spending was. They would continue to support us by, lending us money and taking our dollars in return. And that's all changing, and it's changing rapidly. However, here in the US, policymakers still have their blinders on, and they imagine that the US dollar will never be challenged as the world's reserve currency, and that we can continue to print money wantonly, indefinitely, and they'll just suck it up. And in reality, they're not doing that anymore. They're not buying our treasury bonds anymore, and they're diversifying actually out of our dollars into gold and into oil and strategic resources. And then they're starting to trade in local currencies so that they don't have to transact in dollars. So I think, the demise of US hegemony is really upon us. And the Biden administration and so many in Washington are just sleeping right through it as if it's not a reality. And this is incredibly dangerous, both for our economy and our national security. quite
It's
frankly.
certainly my sense. Every time I've been out of the country in the last year, it's very obvious that America's control over the world's financial systems is in decline, and that maybe that has scary consequences. Do you think it's that no one in Washington knows it's happening, or it's just too awful to face?
You know, I ask myself that question a lot, Tucker, and I've concluded that for Wall Street, it's clearly a thought that's just far too difficult to acknowledge. Like the truth hurts too much to accept it, so they continue
Yes.
to, indulge these fantasies that there is no competition for the U.S. dollar. In Washington, I'm sure they have to know because they're seeing this happen. The Treasury is aware that foreign central banks aren't showing up routinely at their auctions like they used to. Quite the contrary. China's been a net seller of treasuries for years and years now. Russia has no U.S. Treasury holdings at all. They've completely depleted all of their Treasury holdings. So in Washington, I'm sure they are aware this is happening, but they have this, as so many politicians do, unmitigated hubris to imagine that somehow they'll be able to figure out how to put this whole thing back together again if it really gets out of control. So, I mean, I don't know. It's a question I ask myself, Tucker. But in the meantime, while we're wrestling with the answer, the trends are shifting, and we're doing nothing about it. I mean, I hate to sound like some schizophrenic on the street corner with my, the end is here signs, as I listen to myself, tell all this kind of grim news. But unfortunately, there are a lot of things that are happening that are sort of big secular shifts in the economic and geopolitical landscape that are being ignored by our
Yes.
policymakers. And, it's scary to watch and know that no one's being serious about these threats.
This has been my obsession since the war in Ukraine started. Now, this may not be precisely your area, I don't know, but I just want to ask you anyway about residential housing markets. People's homes are obviously the main reservoir of their wealth, of their savings. Those markets in a lot of places are frozen. There's just very few transactions. It's hard to know what the market is. What happens over the next year with residential real estate? Do you foresee?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. As you said, the markets are frozen because if you had a 2.8% mortgage and you're going to sell and have to get a 7.8% mortgage, that
Exactly.
doesn't appeal to anyone. Mortgage, the typical mortgage payment for someone who does that is up 60% of the monthly payment. So no one's going to do that, and so we're kind of in a standstill here. I do anticipate that we will have a hard landing, a real recession next year, and the Fed will cut interest rates. And so mortgage rates will start to come down, and maybe that will help loosen things up. But then I also think, I hate to cop out with the, real estate is location, location, location. But in an environment where we're having a recession and that's the catalyst for interest rates coming down and mortgage rates going lower, these high tax states like New York, New Jersey, California, they're all going to have to raise their taxes even more because they'll obviously have more people on social assistance programs, et cetera, and tax revenues will be down. And so, California has already flipped from a surplus to a deficit. If we go into a recession, it's going to have a major problem, and it will obviously raise taxes to fix it. And that will cause a further exodus, in my view, out of these high tax states into the non-tax and low tax states. So again, I think it'll be location, location, location. I don't know if you could paint the residential real estate market with one brush for 2024 for that
Right.
reason. But, I'm not a real estate broker, so I'm not certain
Yeah.
on how that's going to play out. But
It's hard to imagine people will pay, the majority of their income for the privilege of living in New Jersey or Illinois, but, we'll see. So last question, without getting into, all the facets of immigration that are relevant to Americans, just on the economics of it. So you're describing a country that's transitioning from abundance to scarcity, from wealth to, in some cases, poverty. And we're at the exact same moment importing tens of millions of the world's poorest people into our country and putting them on public assistance. So just as an economic matter, leaving aside the cultural effects, what does that do to our economy?
Well, I mean, the brainer answer to that is it just ensures that these massive fiscal deficits that we've been running are going to continue ad infinitum into the future and quite possibly grow even larger. And where that brings me to is, again, going back to this conversation about the dollar, used to be that we could run these deficits without any increase in our interest rates because
Right.
the rest of the world was so enamored with holding our US treasuries, and they don't anymore. So that leaves only one potential buyer for our treasury debt to finance these deficits, and that is the Federal Reserve. So if the Federal Reserve essentially prints the money to hand to Washington to provide these social assistance programs to the immigration and everything else that they want to do, the dollar will be the valve for those sins. And
Yeah.
the way that is manifest in the US is through higher inflation. This is the preferred way to get inflation, is to have the dollar silently decline in the background, because the average guy doesn't understand what that means. But ultimately what it means is that when you go to Walmart, the price of everything that's imported from China is suddenly going to be twice as expensive as a consequence.
Yeah.
So, ultimately, that's where I see this whole immigration problem going. It just compounds our untenable fiscal situation, and the outlet for that will be the dollar and possibly the end of its reserve currency standing in the next, few years, quite possibly.
So that's just a total reset of our standard of living. Yeah. Lots of consequences for that. Every time we talk, Stephanie, I think, boy, I hope she's wrong. But every time I think she's probably not. So I appreciate that analysis. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. And I hope I'm wrong too. I sincerely do.
Of course I know. Good to see you.
Thanks, Tucker.